Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the book launch. My name is Professor Jo Crotty, and as Director of Edge Hill's Institute for Social Responsibility, I'm welcoming you all to discuss the book Narrating Childhood with Children and Young People, Diverse Contexts, Methods and Stories of Everyday Life. This launch is sponsored and supported by the Institute for Social Responsibility, or ISR, here at Edge Hill. ISR is an interdisciplinary hub that promotes and supports research within the widest conceptualizations of social responsibility. And so when we were approached to support this event on such an important topic, we said yes enthusiastically. The book is a co-edited volume by our very own Lisa Moran, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Social Sciences here at Edge Hill, alongside Dr. Bernardine Brady, a lecturer in the School of Political Science and Sociology at NUI Galway, and Dr. Kathy Riley, a lecturer in geography, also at NUI Galway. This afternoon, we also have 4 speakers that will follow Lisa and Bernardine, and I will be your host. The first speaker will be Maggie O'neill. Maggie is a professor in sociology at the University College of Cork. Maggie is an interdisciplinary scholar and has undertaken extensive research on migration, sex work, race, crime and justice, and the arts. Our second speaker will be Virginia Morrow. Dr. Virginia Morrow is a visiting professor at UCL. Her research focuses on children's work, violence affecting children, sociological approaches to the study of childhood, and children's rights. Our third speaker is Rachel Thompson. Rachel is a professor of childhood and youth studies at the University of Sussex. She's a sociologist whose research interests include the study of life course and transitions, as well as the interdisciplinary fields of gender and sexuality studies. And finally, Kirsty Paulina Kallio will be our final speaker. Kirsty is a professor of environmental pedagogy at Tampere University in Finland. Her current interdisciplinary work focuses on refugees, borders, and lived citizenship. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Lisa and Bernardine, who will set the scene for the book for you. Over to you, Lisa and Bernardine.
Thanks very much, Jo, and thanks again for all of your support, and particularly as well to Danny for providing such fantastic administrative support on the whole event. So thanks to you both. It's lovely to see so many colleagues here today. From Edge Hill, but also from NUI Galway, the Sociological Association of Ireland, and also farther afield in Europe, particularly the European Sociological Association. Wherever you're from, thank you very much for coming. Bernardine and Kathy and I really appreciate it. So just to prefigure what our 4 speakers are going to talk about, I'm going to give a bit of framing around the book and particularly around our collaboration. And a couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege of presenting something very similar on this to the Faculty of Education on behalf of the 3 of us in Edge Hill, because these types of collaborations are really interesting, they're really important, but also within the British context, which is very much framed around the Research Excellence Framework. We know, for instance, that many of these forms of collaborations, such as co-edited books, etc., are often not so much valued, we'd say, as much as sole edited papers. So obviously with this accent, I'm not from Ormskirk originally. I'm from the west of Ireland, which is where I am right now. But I've had the privilege of working with colleagues in Edge Hill since 2017. And before that, I had the great privilege of working in NUI Galway as well for years. So I have a very strong interest in many different areas that connect very strongly to biographies and to narrative as well, particularly around emotions, the emotions, for instance, emotional attachments of veterinarians, farmers, etc. I've been a senior lecturer in social sciences since 2019, and this exposure to the work in Edge Hill and the work that we do with students in terms of our courses has really brought this interest to bear in narratives and biographies, not only in terms of my research, but also in terms of my teaching. And in 2019, I set up the Biographical Narrative and Life Course Research Group, which is now the largest study group of the Sociological Association of Ireland. This collaboration is a long time in the making because Kathy and I go back over 20 years. And it's funny, we started in NUI Galway together in 2000, and I think when we were both shy first years, we never imagined that the day would come that we would be launching a co-edited book together. So Kathy, as we know, is a lecturer in human geography. She has very, very strong interest around children's geographies and education. Bernadine and I also go back a long way to 2005, I think, when we were both doing our PhDs, and we happened to meet at a seminar that was run by our wonderful colleague, Dr. Anne Byrne in NUI Galway. And since then, Bernadine has went on to become the Associate Director of the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre, and Bernadine and I have also worked together on several projects. But interestingly, Kathy and Bernadine had never worked together. So in some ways, I might have been the linchpin of the collaboration. All of us had a lot of experience collaborating with external bodies such as other universities, but also working collaboratively with charities, with funding organisations, etc. And the book really, the genesis of the book was the 2016 International Irish Narrative Research Conference at NUI Galway. And it was literally a chat that the three of us had in the lobby. And I remember saying something like, I would love to do a book with the two of you, a co-edited book, where we would think about the intersections between our three disciplines. So I identify very strongly as a sociologist. I know Bernadine does also, and she has a very strong background in child and youth research. Kathy comes very much from human geography as well. So there are many intersections between child and youth research, sociological theory, if you want, even though the distinctions are not so marked between child and youth research and sociology, and there's a huge interplay, and also human geography. So these long-standing relationships really held us in good stead and influenced the project's development. So we started off very much doing a literature search in 2016, and we were convinced really that there was a potential niche for a book like this that brought together, very much a strong collaborative interdisciplinary book around children and young people, how they narrate, what it means to narrate, and what it means, for instance, to narrate from a social work perspective, from a geography perspective, from a child and youth perspective. And because each different discipline that's represented within the book, and I know that there are so many colleagues that are here today, for instance, who wrote chapters in the book as well. And we became really interested in the whole notion of space and place, and the different spaces that young people inhabit, how they inhabit them, and how they narrate these spaces, for want of a better way of saying it. So we were also very interested in participation, and led very much by that literature, the diversity of spaces and places, which is evident in the book, in how young people, for instance, their sense of becoming, their sense of being within the home, in recreational spaces. But we also didn't leave methodological innovation behind. And I think this is one of the unique selling points of the book, is that we were really interested in finding people's practical examples of using these methods in practice, whether it's ethnography like Orla McGarry's work, or Kirsty Paulina's work on mapping, and the work as well that TJ Hughes and Kathy as well did together on young people's narrations of space in urban encounters as well. And the other part of this that led me to think that there was a bit of karma involved was that Bernadine and Cormac Forkin and I had an abstract in the British Sociological Association conference a couple of years ago. Someone happened to contact Bernadine through email from Palgrave Macmillan to ask if one of us happened to be at the conference that day, that they were really interested in talking to us about a book in relation to young people's spaces and places. So it was almost like all the planets and stars aligned all at once that we were meant to do this. So just to give you an overview really of what the key aims are, that it'll help you to reflect, I think, when the speakers begin, is that one of the key aims was really to bring together a diversity of approaches to narrative inquiry, to think about the different ways that concepts of narration, what it means to narrate, are understood in different research contexts with young people, and also to examine the immense value of narrative research in everyday settings, and the notion of the everyday and the ordinary, and how the ordinary can be problematized, and how ordinary encounters that we have in everyday life are actually multidimensional and are extraordinary in themselves. And again, you know, to engage with very much critical methodological debates about narrative and to create a deeper understanding of how these methods are used in practice, and also the barriers and the levers, if you want, that researchers negotiate to utilise them, and also ethical issues as well that emerge. So I suppose just to go a little bit deeper, you know, there's a strong international and interdisciplinary perspective to this book, which I think is evident across the different speakers that we have. And thanks again to all of you, and to Maggie as well for agreeing to launch it. It's been fantastic to have you all on board. And the different ways of understanding what narrative is. And I really like this notion of narrative as a portal. It's a way of almost being transported into people's lived realities, and as both an interactive and an interpretive product all at once. There was a very strong emphasis as well in this book on seldom heard voices, like, for instance, young people who were often seen as non-participators in Salford in the UK. Amy Harrigan's work was really good on that. Homeless youth, which was Paula Mayock and Sarah Parker, and also Muslim, young people from Muslim backgrounds in the rural Ireland, and Orla McGarry's work as well was exemplary on that. And they were such, you know, each author was so fantastic as well to work with. So I want to say thank you very, very much for your collegiality the whole way through. So this is my email address, lisa.moran@edgehill.ac.uk, and this is the full reference to the book. So for those of you that have read it so far, I hope you enjoy it. And for those of you that haven't read it, I hope that today inspires you to go and read it. And thanks again for coming. We really, really appreciate it. So Joe, if you'd like to introduce the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, and great for sticking to time. If we can all do that, then we'll all stay within the hour. So I'm now going to hand the floor over to Maggie O'Neill. It's all yours, Maggie.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And first of all, a massive thanks for inviting me to speak at the launch. It really is an honour and a privilege. I've spent the last, I suppose, 32 years in my own career biography, conducting, listening, co-creating, writing life stories, biographies and narratives around work, migration, belonging, becoming citizens, negotiating the criminal justice system, and often using multimodal methods, visual, filmic, performative methods. I was completely blown away by the book. Just deeply impressed by the content, research, interpretation, analysis, and the stories in the chapters. It is a beautifully written and crafted book, and framed by, you know, a wonderful introduction and epilogue by the editors. It was a pleasure to read this fantastic collection and contribution to narrative and biographical research and methods, biographical and narrative research methods, drawing upon such excellent and innovative work with children and young people. And I just want to quote the Lisa, Kathy and Bernadine in the editor's introduction, who tell us that narrative methodologies have been used to better understand young people's experiences with regard to a myriad of social issues across diverse cultural settings. And I think this is absolutely true. You know, just beautiful chapters. The chapters on homelessness, young carers in Northern Ireland, Growing Sideways with Emily, Rachel Thompson's chapter, visual and video narratives of belonging amongst Muslim teens in rural Ireland, young people's narratives of taking part in community citizenship activities in Manchester, studying children's experiential worlds through spatial narratives at Kirsty Paulina's chapter, understanding community culture and recreation as resilience resources for Indigenous young people in Canada, growing up in Ireland, the NIM analysis of adults' experience of child sexual abuse in childhood, and Virginia's and Jane's chapter 12, a really fascinating analysis of girls' imagined futures described in essays written in 1969 by children who were part of the 1958 British cohort study. This chapter really touched me because I was born in 59, so I was 10 when the study was taking place. And the authors say our focus is on the ways that the girls in this sample imagined how they would assume responsibility for childcare and domestic work. The rich material generated points to methodological strengths of using the technique of eliciting essays about the future. So these are wonderful accounts of their imagined futures. And as I said, I was 10 at the time. So a question begging to be answered, of course, and the authors raise this, is how 11-year-olds today might imagine themselves at 25 years old in terms of gendered expectations and identities. And as they say, it would be fascinating to ask. I want to highlight 3 points. And the book highlights 3 points for me in terms of my reading. First of all, the vital importance of narrative and biographical research in current times. And this, this is reflected in the book alongside the relationship between what Peter Alheit calls small and big stories. The strength and meaning of narrative methods and narrative theorizing is expressed so well and is summarized in the wonderful chapter by Anne Phoenix, chapter 13, who summarizes the importance of narrative analysis and the fact that, as Bruner states, we lead storied lives. So thinking back to those girls in 1969, and absolutely in current times of COVID-19 pandemic, what are the challenges for theorizing, experiencing and doing biographical narrative research in these times of social and material distancing, isolation, and for many, ruptures to the biographical trajectory? So biographical narrative research has, as we know, a long and diverse genealogy with centres of excellence all over the globe. And it has, of course, been impacted by the various turns in sociology, the visual, the sensory, the performative, the multimedia and arts-based, and helps us to gain insights into the workings of contemporary society and the relationship between personal, historical, collective, social issues, as well as psychosocial matterings and our internal dialogues. The stories we tell, of course, give meaning to our experiences. At the last ESA conference, so I've been a long-term member of the ESA Research Network 3, which looks at European societies, biographical narrative research in relation to European society, so Biographical Sociology Research Network. And at the last meeting, Lisa was a fantastic participant and collaborator. And we asked, how can we creatively reimagine biographical and narrative research in these new times? And I think this book provides a bit of a blueprint. The use of digital methods, the focus on space and place, on topography, and the agentic quality of the Polaroid photo cube, which was a wonderful chapter. In reading the chapters, I was reminded of Walter Benjamin, the fact that stories have a primary role in the household of humanity. And he also argued that a fragment of a story of a life can tell us so much more than 100 pages of information about a life. So stories are a crucial aspect of human understanding and identities. And there is, of course, a long history of the centrality of biographical and narrative research in the disciplines represented in the book. So creating the space for storytelling also creates the space for dialogue and understanding that can connect biography to structure and history, as C. Wright Mills tells us. But also narrative and biographical interviews, are firmly grounded, as Schutzer said, in members' everyday competencies to narrate their own experiences. And this is certainly the case for Brooke Blair's narrative in chapter 4, when she's faced with a contradiction between her understanding that everyone ought to have a home and seeing people sleeping on the street. The second point I want to make is the importance of the development of creative, digital, mobile, spatial, sensory methods, multimodal methods, that representing life stories in narrative and visual form, in sensory, mobile, digital form, can provide a richer understanding of the complexity of lived experience, challenge us to think differently, but also enable us to reach a wider audience and wider understanding. And I think in this sense, the images that are produced in biographical research are constitutive, they bring something new into the world rather than just representing in mimetic fashion what is already there. So the development of the digital is really important. And I think it's captured really beautifully in the agentic quality of the Polaroid photo cube in chapter 9 on queering understanding and how matter comes to matter. And then finally, last but not least, the importance of doing research with children and young people. Amy Harrigan's chapter, chapter 6, talks about how narrative methods and analysis can be credited for acknowledging young people's voice and agency, most importantly. And this is especially important for young people who are otherwise liminal. And secondly, Rachel Thompson makes the point about, it is about the role of the researcher, or thinking about the point of view of the researcher. It's important to focus on children and young people, but also our own effective involvement as researchers working with children is also important. We can acknowledge the child within, as well as facilitate space for children and young people to tell their stories in their own words, and often mediated by drawing, playing, creating, and making. So finally, I wish you all the very best with your joint and separate endeavours. The context of academia has become more businesslike, more competitive, and the neoliberal university can be a cold place. I think Lisa's already pointed to, the kind of, the issues, around what counts in terms of ref. The research shared in this book and here today brings interdisciplinary perspectives, offers new ways of doing, celebrating, sharing, narrating biographical research, advancing better understanding of the lives and experiences of children and young people. And I think this collaboration and what you've achieved is a really excellent model for us all. And if I may just finish with a quote from the introduction by Lisa, Kathy and Bernadine, it's coming back to the idea of a portal. In the life of a child, storytelling is implicit, both as storyteller and listener. Stories form part of everyday life, providing portals to explore the often imaginative worlds offered by and through the lens of a story, while offering children and young people opportunities to narrate experience that shape and reflect their life experiences. Thank you very much, and wish great success for you all and the book.
Thanks very much, Maggie. Now handing back over to Virginia Morrow. The floor is yours.
I'm extremely flattered to be invited to speak on this occasion. And Maggie, thanks for that beautiful presentation. This is going to be a little bit more ad hoc. I'm also really pleased to be in the book, I have to say. And that was really happenstance, because I met Lisa at a conference in Salzburg, and I don't know how we got talking about this chapter that I've written, but here it is. So I'm really pleased about that. And what I'm going to do is just have a short personal reflection, but then I'm going to actually tell you about the chapter. I hope that's okay. Oh, there's lots of people. I can see names. Okay, so how times have changed, right? And I am feeling quite elderly now. The children who wrote these essays in 1969, when they were 11, I was actually 12. So I was born in 1957. So like Maggie, the essays take me back to my own childhoods. But if I think to when I began my academic career as a PhD student I finished my PhD in 92. So I began in the late 80s. It was so clear that, and at the time my PhD research was also based on children's writing, their written accounts of what they did when they were not at school. The number of times I would recount in my college to people when they asked politely what I was studying, that I was asking children to write descriptions for me. The number of times that I was told, well, why on earth are you doing that? You can't believe a word that children say. How can you even begin to think about doing that? And what's so nice to see, well, we know now there's been decades of research in sociology of childhood, but it's so nice to see this edited collection with so many different various forms and ways of gathering children's accounts and analysing them very seriously. So I'm just so happy to see that there's such attention and focus given now to narrative analysis of children's accounts of whether it's their childhoods within childhood, or their imaginations about the future, or literally their lived realities and experiences. So that's very good to hear. So I want to just tell you a little bit about our chapter. So there's a very large, some of you will be extremely familiar with this, but UK has a very long tradition of longitudinal studies, that is cohort studies of cohorts of children, and one of them, perhaps most famous, is the National Child Development Study that began with a group of children born in 1958. And there had been earlier ones, but this is perhaps the key one. It's still ongoing. And if I don't run out of time, I'll tell you an anecdote right at the end about meeting one of the members of the cohort who must have written one of these essays. But when the children were aged 11, as Maggie's just said, in 1969, they were completing a short questionnaire at school about their leisure interests, their preferred school subjects, and their expectations on leaving school. That was a little questionnaire. I'm just going to try to pull up an essay now. They were also asked to write an essay on the following topic. Imagine you are now 25 years old, write about the life you're leading, your interests, your home life, and your work at the age of 25. You have 30 minutes to do this. So there were 13,669 essays completed. The average length was 204 words. Some were very, very short, some were very, very long. And these copies of these original essays, they were written obviously in children's handwriting, were stored on microfiche at the then Centre for Longitudinal Studies at the Institute of Education. And for many years, they were never looked at, coded, or analysed. I'm just gonna minimise my screen. Hang on. And I'm going to find you an example to show you. So this is just the beginning of it's obviously goes on for a couple of pages, but this is a very typical kind of example of what was there available on microfiche. And so Jane Elliott, this was mostly at the instigation of Professor Jane Elliott, who's worked very, very closely with the National Child Development Study over the years. She and I put together a short proposal to Nuffield Foundation and extracted a tiny amount of money to do some research on the essays. So obviously we couldn't begin to transcribe all of them, but we took a small sample of 521 essays that were coded for word count and had them typed up and then used them to analyze. And that's the basis of some of the work that we've done on the essays. I have to say we did this work quite a long time ago, so that's another reason to be really pleased to be in the book. But nobody, just in terms of research ethics, which of course I'm really interested in, and indeed the purpose of undertaking this task, there was never any real kind of clarity about why these essays were collected or what was going to be done with them. Apparently there was some research done on a subsample on the syntactic maturity of the children, but nothing that really, saw the children as co-producers of data in any way. So it was really fantastic to have the opportunity to look at them in some detail. So Jane and I and some extremely kind, helpful research assistants created basically a database of transcribed essays, and then we set about analysing them. There's plenty of evidence, description in the chapter about the coding approach that we took, but in this particular chapter, Jane has a paper, I should say, in sociology that was published in 2010. In the chapter, however, partly because of my own research interests, I was really keen to explore how children, girls in particular, imagined their futures in terms of domesticity and actually trying to also work? Did they see themselves, how did they imagine that in the future? And the children, there was, as I say, a big range of length of essays, children's styles of writing, their spellings even that could be distracting. So actually we decided to correct spellings and, you know, very lightly just adjust the essays. But in a way, I felt very strongly, particularly, that children were very much reflecting the context of their everyday lives that they were experiencing. So just to remind you, I'm hoping that you can all hear me because I'm now looking at my own screen. This was the kind of material that, well, when I say remind you, you're probably all much younger than me and Maggie, but the kind of popular culture that the children were seeing, the kind of dolls and toys that they were playing with, very highly gendered, of course, and the historical contexts. And these indeed are, to an extent, reflected in the essays. So not in the cases described in the chapter, but some children wrote about the man on the first spacewalks, first landings on the moon, and these do come out in the kinds of things that they describe. But I particularly wanted in the chapter to focus on this combination of domestic and paid labour, and try to explore how they described managing childcare and work. So here's one of the girls who quite simply and straightforwardly, I'll just read her quote, it's not long. "I work in a factory. I have to get out of bed at 6 o'clock and make breakfast for 3. Then I put on my coat and catch the 7:30 bus to Nottingham. When I'm working, my husband dresses Sally and takes her to play school, and at 1:30 in the afternoon, I come home from work, fetch Sally from play school and get her dinner. My husband has his dinner, then goes to work. I stop at home, do the washing and jobs at home. I usually sew and make clothes. I earn £20 a week. My husband earns 25. So that's a pretty kind of straightforward example of a girl describing how she sees the future. And mostly, I think, because I don't have much time, I should sum up.
You've actually run out of time.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear a beep. I think I better stop. But just to say that the children took the topics really seriously. They understood that they were part of a study, and, you know, they really did illustrate this what they perceived as a kind of contradiction or difficulty they may be facing about combining domesticity and work in the future, which is it. Sorry to overrun. Thanks a lot.
So without further ado,
yes,
we're going to move on to Rachel Thompson. So Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and hi Jenny, long time no see. Lovely to see you. Bit of a strange way for us all to communicate. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me both to talk today and for inviting me to be part of the book. Okay, so the origins of my chapter lie very much in my teaching. I teach an MA module on theorising childhood, and in particular on a session on imagined childhoods. And in this session, I encourage students to be critical of developmentalist notions of childhood, building on the critique of childhood as a becoming, but also adding to that critiques of reproductive futurism that have been developed within queer theory. I encourage students to engage with how powerful the figure of the child can be as a focus for sentimentality, identification, nostalgia, and how the child within can so easily be appealed to by advertisers, politicians, fundraisers. We think about how the figure of the child is racialized and sexualized in historically specific ways, and what it means for certain children to be left out of the romantic vision of childhood innocence and vulnerability, children who are imagined without a future. I asked the children, I asked the students, who are mostly not children, to engage with two ideas. The first is the figure of Mignon as captured by Goethe and theorised in a wonderful book by Caroline Steedman, the ill-fated child acrobat who's encountered by Master Wilhelm, who will never grow up and whose lack of a future, Steedman argues, is the basis not just of Wilhelm's fascination, but also of a sense of interior space that constitutes the bourgeois subject, and which she argues is the origins of the novel and, in a sense, our modern understanding of narrative. The second comes from the work of Catherine Bon Stockton, who encourages us to think beyond the imperative of growing up to engage with various kinds of growing sideways. Starting with the figure of the gay child who cannot inhabit the normative profile of a reproductive future, she invites us to expand our temporal vocabularies and to develop curiosity about what it feels like to be a child. So in my chapter for the book, I draw on an example from my own fieldwork to explore the interplay of these theoretical concepts, a child within and growing sideways. I also share something of the uncanny temporal experience of making research. The chapter focuses on conversations with 7-year-old Emily, who invites me into her room to talk about her favourite things. In sharing these precious objects, I learn about Emily's preoccupations, her desire to slow down the process of growing up, and her own nostalgia about her childhood that at 7 she already feels is slipping away. We talk about keeping things, storing and saving memorabilia, and it prompts me to think about my relationship with my son, who then was just almost at the end of secondary school, and to wonder why I was so keen. I would say still am, so keen to clear away the material culture of his childhood. Embracing the metaphor of growing sideways, Emily and I explore some of the heterogeneous temporalities of our shared present that includes both the slow recursive temporalities of academic time, so the time it takes between the making of those documents and then the making of a book, for example. The vivid immediacy of encounters within fieldwork, moment to moment. The unfolding and entangled biographical time of the researcher and the researched. And then those intergenerational narratives of childhood that circulate obliquely within families and include unconscious as well as conscious time. I think I've got time now to share one example of the kind of sideways swerves that our conversation took, and to think a bit with you about what it might mean to grow sideways. So a great deal of Emily's play involved dressing dolls and creatures of various kinds. Miniature clothing was carefully folded and stored, and detailed accounts were provided of how, when particular items were secured. The following swerve in our conversation felt important at the time, and again, also on revisiting the material. During most of our time together, I asked Emily questions. However, here, she instigates a line of conversation about school uniforms, which seems to mark the boundaries of a future into which she is in no hurry to cross. So I ask Emily asks me, do you think that I go to a school with a uniform? I think, no. You're right. I go to the Martlet school. Did you get to wear, when you went to school, did you have to wear a uniform? Well, I had different ones. The first school I went to, I didn't have to wear a uniform, but then the head teacher changed and you did have to wear a uniform. And then my mum said that we didn't have to wear it, but everyone else did. And that was really embarrassing. Then I went to a different school and no one wore a school uniform. And then I went to another school and no one wore a school uniform. And then I went to secondary school where everyone wore a school uniform. And there was no big deal on that one, was there? No. So what do you think about school uniform? Well, I heard that every school nowadays is, every single one except for Martlet school, all have to wear school uniform. And at secondary school, everyone has to wear school uniform. And what do you think of that? I think they should never, ever, 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 ever let them. Because I think that you should just wear what you want and be free and be happy. Because I've got 4 more years until I'm 3 more years until I'm in year 6. So it's kind of the difference. What, the close of the difference between primary and secondary school? Yes, and I don't like it. Do you like choosing what you wear these days? Yeah. And how does that happen in the morning? Does it take ages to decide? No. Okay. I'd rather be happy and free. In my field notes, I capture the significance of this moment of interaction in terms of Emily asks me a question about time, the future, change, sense of growing up, loss of freedom, awareness of lack of time, uniform as a marker of time and being managed, moving between small world play and big world reflections. So maybe this is what it might mean for a child to turn her back on the future, naming and resisting the modes of management associated with schooling and becoming part of an institutionalized trajectory. Looking at this moment again with the benefit of hindsight, I also see it as a reaching out for reassurance and solidarity. I'm asked to recount my own story of school uniform that by default involved a complicated inventory of school change and precarity. Emily inquires, yet reassures me that it was no big deal. There's plenty of time, still, 3 more years before she needs to be ready. And as my experience testifies, people have survived it before. And anyway, nowadays, it seems to be unavoidable. Until then, she can be in a never, ever, ever dressing and undressing dolls, photographs herself, her parents, her friends. The conversations with Emily are drawn from pilot research, those creative endeavours that come before the main event, that are half real life and half research. I've stayed in conversation with Emily around this chapter. We presented a version of the paper together at a book launch for the Researching Everyday Childhoods book. It represents a thinking together that's also a playing together and became a writing together. So to end, I'd like to thank Lisa, Kathy and Bernadine for the invitation to contribute to the collection. And writing it has really helped me in my teaching, but also in my relationship with Emily. But it's also given me a metaphor for understanding the craft of situated narrative research, something that I've dedicated quite a lot of creative energy to. And this is very much Emily's gift to me, the image of the doll. So I say, perhaps we can think of the interview as being like a doll, wrapped in tissue, stored in a drawer and taken out sometimes to be played with. And through these recursive acts of curation, reanimation and representation, stories are collaboratively forged, circulated, recycled and decorated. And I'm just thinking about Ginny's presentation, perhaps those lovely stories on microfiche, we can think of that as being something wrapped in tissue, somewhere safe to be taken out and played with. So that's it, thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And I'd like to say that my school uniform was bottle green and it was grim. So I'm sure others had a better experience than I did. So our final speaker is Kirsty Paulina Kallio. And after that, we'll be taking some questions. So if you have questions to pose any of the speakers, please put them in the chat and I will pose them on your behalf when Kirsty's finished speaking. So Kirsty, it's over to you now.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, the Nordic part. I'll share my screen. This is the title of my chapter. I've grown up never seeing anything else. So you'd think that you'd obviously be a strong, happy area because it's somewhere I'm used to, somewhere I'm familiar with, but the area itself has just got worse over the years. We've got neighbors that they've sort of threatened my mom on a number of occasions. They've never done anything violent, but there's a lot of people on that estate who have given up with progressing in life. I wouldn't say that they're depressed or anything like that. They've just given up with working or further education. They don't care. They live off of, basically they live off of the government. They sit on the arses most of the days and they smoke drugs and yeah, it's just bad reputation on the area. The area is, suits its reputation, it's good. It's bad reputation, but it's not somewhere I feel unsafe. It's just somewhere I don't like. The Fisher Family Trust is what you get, plus your background and everything, which gives you a grade. So for me, because of where I live, it gets pulled down significantly. So I was pre-directed to get a D in maths, and that was down to the fact I got a 4. And the whole area, a 4 should have been like a B grade, but they pulled it right down for a D, and the school wouldn't explain why it was a D. And then I got to the point where I was working higher than my target grade, and there was no reason behind the actual target grade itself, apart from the fact that my background is quite rubbish. My mom never got well in school, and the area itself, people don't care about the school. I know people who've been here and they've been left, and they didn't do anything with their life. They didn't come about any better for it. So I thought, why am I going to here when I don't feel the same way? I want to do well. I just felt that by being here, I was getting pulled down. So far, all I've got is this. I live in an area which has a very rough rating. I went to school that was in special measures, so the chances of me getting into quite high universities like Oxford and Cambridge, which is some of the things I'd really like to do, is quite slim because they look on grades. But they're not just going to look on your grades. They want to see what you've come from. They want to see what type of person you're going to get. They want to see what background you come from. There's no way I'm going to change, or other people in my area are going to change, if we just get pulled down by the background and where we come from when we go to school. It should really be down to whether you're good, if you're good at something or not. But people want the best, and they're going to look for someone who's from like a posh Cambridge family, and they've got 4 kids and a nice house. They've got good grades, they're going to get good jobs, they're going to have a better chance of doing that than someone who lived just with their mom in a council house and an estate just got worse over the years. And then they went to a school that was in special measures. Then chances of them getting a job is quite slim compared to the other, which is quite unfair. Everyone who asks me, what am I going to do next year, has said, are you sure you really think you can cope with all the workload? And don't you think it'll be a bit too hard? And I've taken computer science and maths and physics, and then psychology as just something else I want to try, see what it's like. But a lot of people tell me I should maybe not do all physics as well as maths and computer science. But I'm like, well, they all link together. So it's sort of going to help me out, and I enjoy them all. So I might just well do that. Well, in education, I want to do well, and then be able to basically show off that actually someone can actually come from shit background, go through shit stuff, and then come about better than the rest. That's my aim. And I think that's probably the main positive thing that I have. That's something that's holding me back from slipping completely, is the fact that I want to prove to people that you can do whatever you want to, and you can upset them, and you can bully people, but you can't stop them from doing well, which is what I want to do. So that's mainly the thing, not just to get a career, but it's basically to prove to people that you can pull me down, but I'm not going to be pulled down properly. Now, this narrative was from a study that I conducted in Northern England, as you could see, perhaps from the maps that I showed you. The maps are pretty red, and red was the color, the negative color in the mapping exercise that we did to begin the narrative collection of materials. But from the chat, from the discussion that we had with this girl whom I'm calling Rebecca, you can find out very different things than that just by looking at the maps. And this is the idea of the method that I've been using to collect narratives from children and youth about their topological worlds. And the example that I just read and showed you through the maps is not included in the book. It's in another publication that I've written a couple of years previously, but it's from the same study. And it really shows, I think, greatly that how building a narrative material that has different ways of engaging with somebody's everyday life is really enriching. And here you can see on this slide, you can see the analytical, 3 analytical layers that I've used in interpreting these materials. I'm not going to read them out loud, they're in the book, but this is the sort of how I've worked through these materials that include maps, chats or discussions or interviews, however you want to call them, done in a very sort of low threshold manner. And then we had some supplementary materials as well to back this up if they wanted to produce them, the kids we worked with. This example is in the book, another example of the 3 types of materials that we gathered: the mapping exercise, then the chat or the interview that you can see on the front of the text written by this child as a supplementary material. And what I got from this example, which is opened up in the book, is, for example, a familial topology. And I've been working on topologies of the home also in my previous research. And I think this was really a good case to show how these kinds of methods that I've used open up the world in a rather different way than the sort of territorially based methods that are often used when studying lived realities. So this example I have used, for example, to open up the familial geographies that children lead through. And it brings out very different kinds of attachments, very different kinds of relations that children can have with their worlds. Grandparents in Hull, Greece as not as a country, but as a signification for a place where they've been going to, where they have established emotional relations, and the different places that come through, like the Ape Park in the Dolby Forest Ape Park, where I've never been to, but I think I have a pretty good idea what the place is, and what the place is, especially for this child who described it to me through her grandparental relations that sort of build into the place. So this is the sort of kind of narrative work that I've done, and it's not. I didn't really think that I was doing my narrative analysis, or I was setting out to do narrative work in this research project. But when I was invited to this book, I realized that of course it's narrative analysis. Of course it's narration that I've been building, spatial narration, and that's sort of my contribution to the book. And this is more or less the part that I had not published before, and the book really offered me an opportunity, unlikely a journal article would do, to really write out the basic idea of this methodological approach, rather than making an argument that in a journal article you never know where you end up when it's gone through all the review rounds. So I was really happy to write this piece into this book, and to sort of make very explicit through different examples, but also through a very thorough going through these different layers and steps in the data collection and in the analysis, to show how we can try to work with people, not only children and youth, but anybody whose lived realities we cannot know, how different dimensions can be highlighted through this kind of 3-layered analysis, and through different kinds of materials that help us in creating a narrative that is both subjective from the participant's perspective, but also gives it contextual framing through which the analysis can be conducted. And as you know, that I'm not British, and I'm not from Leeds, nor any other Northern European place where I did this research. I was really sort of an alien to all these places in Britain that the kids talked about, or in France or in Portugal, where they had made visits often. So I was really like an anthropologist in Northern England doing this work, but I've done similar work in Southern Finland, which is much more familiar to me, and it's been quite interesting to see how exactly the narrative analysis shows that I was nearly as much an alien in the Finnish children and young people's worlds, because everybody's lived experience of the world is different, regardless of where they live. But of course, the cultural context was easier there for me to bring into the analysis, carrying with it also the risk of already knowing, which I wouldn't have in Northern England. So I also want to join in the others in thanking the editors and the publisher for putting together this volume, and it's already in use in my grad seminar that I just finished before coming to this event, and in our university and in Finland within childhood studies and youth studies. So thanks again, and thanks for including me in this book launch.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Well, we haven't had any questions posed in the chat, and sadly we've also run out of time. So I'm just going to thank our speakers and the book editors, Lisa, Bernadine and Kathy, for the book. Everybody seems to love it, so if you haven't got a copy, make sure you get yours. I'm sure that Lisa can direct you to where you can obtain a copy. And also thank you to our speakers, Maggie, Virginia, Rachel and Kirsty. Really fascinating hour, really made me want to read the book, even though this is not my area. And so thank you very much to everybody for your insights and piquing our interest. So I'm going to leave you now to the rest of your afternoon. Have a good evening, everybody, and thanks very much for attending.